Now, if you're a Pontiac fan, you more than likely know about the Catalina 2+2s that were offered from the 1964 through 1967 model years. This so-called big brother to the Pontiac GTO was Pontiac's full-size performance vehicle during these years. It was a trim option on the Catalinas, although for 1967, Catalina badging did not appear anywhere on the vehicle. Here is one particularly stellar example of a U.S. built and sold Pontiac 2+2. And this one comes with the hood-mounted tack even. It's a pretty sweet-looking vehicle. It has that GM fastback style design that was so popular during this time frame, and a very unique front end that was quite different from the 1966 and even 1965 stacked headlamp Pontiacs, in part because this Pontiac was designed by the Advanced Studios as opposed to the regular production studios that did the 1965 and 1966 variants. If you want to learn more about this, be sure to watch a video with Dick Rusin on his contribution to the 1967 Pontiac design that you can find on my channel. However, the subject of this video is going to be a different 2+2, one that came standard with a 6-cylinder engine from the factory. A 6-cylinder engine, you say? I thought the 2+2 was the performance variant. Well, it was in the U.S., and in fact, it came standard with a 428 cubic inch, 360 horsepower Pontiac-sourced V8 that was topped by a Rochester 4-barrel carburetor. So it really was backing up the, let's say, marketing image of being a performance vehicle with some stout performance under hood. But the vehicle that we're going to talk about, as I said, came standard with a 6-cylinder engine, although you could get various V8s in it, though they were different V8s from those offered in the U.S. And that is the Canadian Pontiac 2+2, the Parisienne 2+2. This was also exported to other markets outside of Canada, but Canada was really the home country where this was initiated. And here you can see an example of a Parisian 2+2 from 1967. This one does have a V8 underhood. I'm not quite sure which V8, but we're going to look in more detail at one with the standard engine momentarily. Now, the Parisian 2+2 actually debuted in Canada for the 1967 model year. As I mentioned, it started in 1964 in the U.S., ran from 1964 through 1967 model years in the U.S. In Canada, it would debut for the 1967 model year and would continue through 1970. So the 2+2 actually had a longer lifetime in Canada, or at least it stayed around longer through 1970 versus 1967 in the U.S. And it replaced the Parisian Custom Sport, not the Super Sport like Chevrolet had and not anything else that Pontiac had, but for whatever reason in Canada, they decided to call the sportier models of the Parisian the Custom Sport. Now, one thing to note about the Canadian Pontiacs is that they had Chevrolet engines and transmissions and rode atop Chevrolet chassis and had a number of Chevrolet components. We're going to talk about some of those in a moment here. But notice that this particular car that you're seeing doesn't have hidden windshield wipers. The U.S. Pontiacs had hidden butterfly-style windshield wipers. Here, the Canadian Pontiacs had exposed, kind of typical windshield wipers. And as I mentioned, they were exposed and not hidden by the hood line. And that was because these vehicles had a lot of Chevrolet components. In fact, the wheelbase on the Canadian Pontiacs is 119 inches. On the U.S.-built Pontiacs, if it was a Catalina or a 2+2, it would ride atop a 121-inch wheelbase. So the wheelbase was shorter for the Canadian Pontiacs, again, because they really had Chevrolet chassis underneath them. And remember, in the U.S., that Pontiac was still advertising the so-called wide track look. Well, that was not true in Canada. The track width in Canada was a little under 62.5 inches, both front and rear, with the front and rear track being about the same. In the U.S., the front track was 63 inches and the rear track was 64 inches. So the track was 2 inches narrower on the Canadian Pontiacs versus the U.S. Pontiac. So if you got a Canadian Pontiac of this era, you have a narrow track Pontiac, not a wide track Pontiac. Now, you notice the previous vehicle had V8 badging at the front of the fenders. This vehicle has no such badging because this is a standard Parisian 2+2 with the 250 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine. I still can't believe it, but that was what was standard in these vehicles. This one does have a few options, as you're going to see. Very few, including the Power Glide transmission, the 2-speed Power Glide from Chevrolet, of course. Power steering, power brakes, and really that's about it. At least it has power steering and power brakes. And wait till you see the little tiny power steering pump on this. It's pretty hilarious. But notice the beautiful styling of these Pontiacs for 1967. We talked about the front end, and as I mentioned, the styling was done in the advanced studio for Pontiac. At this point in time, there were different studios for the production vehicles as well as the advanced studios. And the idea was that the advanced studios would look further out into the future, really with unconstrained design. And the production studios, well, had to really design things that could be put into production. But I have to say that I love the body side on this Pontiac, including that very distinctive crease that runs the entire length of the body side, as well as that skeg line that starts ahead of the rear wheel. Now, on some U.S. Pontiacs, that skeg line would also form a rear fender skirt. But for the Parisienne 2+2, the fender skirt was not standard. You have just an open wheel, so the skeg line kind of terminates there. But it looked really cool when it created the fender skirt. Regardless, I have to say this is a beautiful vehicle, and it's amazing how much glass area there is. Look at how tall that side glass is, both the front window as well as the rear quarter. So not only did it look good, it was quite functional as well. Now, remember what I told you about the wheelbase on these Pontiacs? That it was 119 inches versus the U.S. Pontiacs that rode atop 121-inch wheelbase. Well, the short wheelbase Pontiacs did. The Bonneville, as an example, was on the long wheelbase, and that was 124 inches. But here, the 119-inch wheelbase was 2 inches shorter than the U.S. Catalina, as an example. And, well, it creates some interesting views in this side view. What do I mean by that? Well, take a look in particular at the rear wheel on this car. What do you notice about it? It's not in the center of that wheel arch. It's actually off-center, offset toward the front of the vehicle. And I think if I look at it, the front wheel is also offset a little bit toward the rear of the vehicle. So because the bodies were really U.S. Pontiac bodies, by and large, there are some differences. Notice here, the Canadian version has these 5 fender louvers on either side of the fender. The U.S.-built 2+2s don't have 5 fender louvers. They have more than that. They have 7, and it's a different style on either side. Now, why Pontiac wanted to use 5 or 7 is a bit interesting to me. You'd think that they would have the same number as perhaps the relevant number of cylinders on either side, like 4 if it were a V8 or 3. I guess it was just aesthetics. But regardless, they did have different front fenders. But it looks pretty humorous to me to look at the wheel arches and where the wheels and tires sit with respect to them and see that they're off-center, which they clearly are. And you can also see a little bit in this view the narrow track, the body hanging out over the wheels. Remember, you had 2 inches wider track in the rear on the U.S.-built Pontiacs versus the Canadian Pontiacs, and some of that's starting to show up even in the side view. And as we rotate around to the rear three-quarter view, this is perhaps the sexiest view of this particular vehicle. With that fastback roofline, the C-pillar touching down just so elegantly and flowing into the rear quarter, and the deck lid, particularly up by the backlight, having a little bit of concavity to it, as opposed to it just being flat with a tulip panel. Interestingly, there is no tulip panel on this car. The panel in between the backlight and the deck lid, some people call it the Dutchman panel, but this car doesn't have it. The deck lid goes all the way up to the backlight. And I have to say that one of the things that's interesting, too, is in previous years, you had that Pontiac emblem that was creating a crease on the deck lid, looking like it was slipping down the car. Here, that crease in the middle of the deck lid is gone. So the deck lid is pretty bare when it comes to bends and creases, aside from that concavity that I previously mentioned. But it looks absolutely fantastic. I also like how Pontiac executed the Coke bottle styling on this particular variant because you have a number of elements. Look at that rear quarter, particularly just underneath the rear quarter glass. And you see you have this very sharp crease and this filleted area that's forming a shadow underneath that crease up top. Then you have the body side crease, which has a highlight on the top and a shadow on the bottom consequently. And then you have that skeg line. It's just a very sensual looking quarter panel and speaks to the talent of the designers as well as the clay modelers who worked on this vehicle. By the way, here's the louvers that you can see up front on the fender, and a unique style. As again, this was only offered on Canadian Pontiacs. And I have to say, the body fits here, the door fit is pretty good. It's hard to get all these creases to line up. I'm sure manufacturing didn't like the fact that they had to do that, but they did a pretty good job here for the Oshawa-built vehicles. Now let's move inside on this 2+2. And when you got the Parisian 2+2, you got the standard bucket seats that you see here with the console. So at least you get something that was sporty, although the interior trim was different on these Canadian Pontiacs versus the U.S. Pontiacs. The interior trim here and the style of the seat stitching and design is really quite similar to the U.S. Pontiacs, except let's say it's a more simple pattern. There are fewer pleats on the seats here than there were in the U.S. So I guess that they had to save a few bucks. And you'll also see that there is not a rear center armrest. So all in the name of cost savings, I suppose. You'll also notice there are some differences here. The steering wheel, this 3-spoke wheel, was not offered in the U.S. It's kind of a unique Canadian-only item. And we'll talk a little bit more about the IP because while it has the overall similar form of the U.S. Pontiacs, it's quite different. And here's a better look at the IP itself. Now, if this were a U.S.-built Pontiac, it would have wood grain all over the place on the dash, and you can take a look at the inset to see one of those. And the heater controls are also different. Notice the brake and gas pedal are actually borrowed from Chevrolet too. So there are some Chevrolet components on these Canadian Pontiacs, and like I said, there's quite a few unique components, obviously on the outside, the chassis, but as well as the inside. Nonetheless, I still think it's a handsome interior overall. And more specifically, remember in the U.S. that the heater controls really resembled a second radio. You'd have to turn one knob to increase the fan speed, turn another for the temperature. Here, they just have the typical slider bars. So this was a cheaper setup with Bowden cables, didn't have any vacuum-actuated elements under the dash or vacuum-actuated servos to move the air. You had to just do it manually through Bowden cables, and I suppose that's why Pontiac employed this style of heater control. It was cheaper than what they employed in the U.S. Remember, U.S. Pontiacs were actually a more up-level trim and a more expensive vehicle than they were in Canada. In Canada, they really were kind of a slightly deluxe Chevrolet. And here's a look at the rear seat on this Parisienne 2+2, and I will say it's a similar kind of seat pattern that was used for a number of years. I mentioned my 65 Bonneville similar. The 67 Pontiacs in the U.S. were also similar, but the seat stitch pattern here is different, or I should say the pleating is different. Notice that there's only a couple pleats in the midsection. There's a series of two series of two pleats on either side. And if you were looking at a U.S. Pontiac, you'd have 3 pleats plus some extra pleating on the side. So it's a more simple seat design overall, I guess, again, to save a few dollars in all likelihood. All right, and now the moment you've all been waiting for, to see the under hood compartment of this 67 2+2. And here you have a 2+2, a so-called sporty Pontiac with a standard 155 horsepower Astro 6 sourced from Chevrolet. 250 cubic inches breathing through a one-barrel carburetor. I just can't get over this. Look at how much space there is in the engine bay because this engine is just so small. At least, as I said, the car does have power steering, which you can see, and power disc brakes. You can see the brake booster there as well. And aside from that, not much else. Clearly not an air conditioning equipped car. But this was the standard engine in the Parisienne 2+2. In fact, it was a standard in all of the full-size Canadian Pontiacs, except for the Grand Parisienne, where you got a standard 283 cubic inch V8. Let's talk for a moment more about the powertrains that you could get under hood in the Canadian Pontiacs, because they were completely different and Chevrolet sourced versus the US-based Pontiacs. So you can see here in the chart from the 1967 Canadian Pontiac brochure, the standard engine was the 155 horsepower Astro 6. Then there was the 195 horsepower Strato Flash, 283 cubic inch V8. That was what was standard in the Grand Parisienne. The 6-cylinder was standard in all other full-size Pontiacs. Then you have the optional cost engines, the 275 horsepower Astro Flame 327 cubic inch V8, the 325 horsepower Astro Jet 396, that would be the big block Chevrolet engine, and the top engine option was a 385 horsepower Jet Flame 427 cubic inch big block sourced from Chevrolet. Now notice you could get a bunch of different transmissions here, 3 speeds, 4 speeds, the Power Glide all the way up to the 396 cubic inch V8, and then you could get the Hydromatic transmission with either the big blocks, or notice the little asterisk there, you could get it with the 275 horsepower small block, the 327 small block, only on the 2+2 or the Grand Parisienne. That little small block would have been a good engine in these vehicles. It was pretty peppy, especially given that it was high compression during this time frame. But many Canadian cars just didn't have the big engines because even back then, gasoline was rather expensive in Canada. So they often went for the smaller engines in vehicles. And because this just has the little 6-cylinder, it has a little radiator. And it's so little, in fact, that notice there's this adapter plate basically to secure it to the front of the vehicle. These vehicles were really built probably assuming that they were going to have the Pontiac V8 and were designed as such. Certainly they had to accommodate much larger engines, but they didn't want to put a big radiator in the 6-cylinder when it wasn't needed because that would obviously cost more money. So you got this smaller radiator with that adapter plate. So what do you think of this Canadian Parisienne 2+2? I think it's a pretty sweet vehicle. Certainly rare. I would love to go to car shows and pop the hood, and people would think just by the 2+2 badging, without looking more closely to notice that it says Parisienne on the back, that there's probably a 428 cubic inch V8 under hood. But no, there's not. This car is all show, no go. That is for sure. But I think it's pretty awesome in its uniqueness. And it's interesting to me, these Canadian Pontiacs really don't get much love outside of Canada. But I do think at some point here, given their relative rarity and the fact that they are these Frankenstein vehicles, I do hope that they catch on. And I think that they will at some point in the future as more collectors really understand even what these Canadian Pontiacs were about and how different they were from U.S. cars. They're a piece of history, and I expect in the next 10 years that they'll take off, at least the specialty models. Well, I guess we'll find out. Thanks again for watching. Put a comment in the comments section.